I think we can just do announcements and then we can start talking about NCA, and then whenever you have to leave, Frank, that's fine. I have some
Thank you.
resources that got sent out this morning that I'd like to share about it. That's about my knowledge, but I just thought because it was released this morning, it would be a good chance to talk about it. So we're recording. Do we want to just jump into announcements?
Well, I do have one that's unless somebody else wants to go first. Should I go, Gina?
Sounds good.
So I'm here in Philadelphia, for those who didn't already hear this chatter, at the Beyond 100K summit. And I think there's a strong, and the goal is to close the STEM teacher gap that currently exists in 20 years by recruiting and training 150,000 teachers, but also to do it with increased diversity. Make the teacher you have is the teacher that represents you in your classroom. And they're looking for partners. So there's a lot of people in the Clean Network who could be a partner in this growing initiative. I mean, it's one of the most powerful efforts I was part of when I was part of, under Obama, the 100K and 10 initiative that succeeded in achieving its goal, but of increasing the number and retaining 100,000 STEM teachers in 10 years. So it's a high impact, high risk, high impact, high challenge network. So if you're interested in joining this, it feels aligned with what you're doing, please let me know, and I can help connect you to the right people. And they do have micro grants for doing work together collaboratively. So there's advantages for people in the Clean Network. And this is for the people here today, but also people who watch this recording. So happy to help bridge you into this community.
Frank, you said we should contact you, or how do we find out more about the initiative?
So there's a website, Beyond 100K, the letter K, that is easy to navigate. So you can learn more about it there. And if you want to look at some of the work that was achieved in 100K and 10, there's videos and reports and all that stuff. So the 100K, yep, there it is, beyond100k.org. A good colleague of mine, Maya Garcia from the Cal State Science Supervisors, left and joined as chief of staff for this group. And she's a long-standing champion for climate change education. So Maya's here. They've got so much talent, but they need more organizations to join to do the lift together. That's why we're in Summit today.
Jim, your hand is up.
Yes, thank you, Gina. And sorry, I'm getting over a cold if I don't sound normal. An announcement that yet another action by middle and high school students would be in mental health. And this comes in, maybe I could start out with this, as those that are in mental health as professionals, I hope would recognize that if you want to really reach middle and high school students, hear from them, be able to influence them, you do not want to turn your back on high school students who are specializing in that subject. Because if you know anything about when you work with young people, they communicate with each other far more than they communicate with older people, right? That, as much as a teacher might, as much as someone want, the students are constantly communicating with each other, their colleagues, how they get their information, how they're seeing things. So a colleague who is in high school who is looking to be a professional mental health person in climate change, but is starting that work now, really has a tremendous advantage in being able to be effective. Part of what this comes up is, as we have gotten started, first with an energy, then with first actually with education and energy, trees, these various areas where young people are able to have a very powerful role in taking action on climate change once we break down And to use the apt term that Frank will refer to when people accuse us of using propaganda, I think our response can be, well, it's propaganda that young people can't do anything about climate change. That is propaganda. The reality is that they can. And I think the more that we see that, not only do we get more students across the country wanting to take part in these projects, but the students will say, I'm very interested in being a mental health professional. I don't know if I want to be an engineer or a scientist. I understand what you're doing. I think it's wonderful. But is there something that mental health has anything to do with climate change? And once they learn how, there's this immediate, let's make this an action that we can work on. So I just wanted to add that in, of that there are now high school students in Washington, D.C., in an all black school or 97% black school that are going to be taking action as future working on it mental health workers in on climate action. So thanks.
Great. I'll jump in. Oh, nice. Frank just shared some resources in the chat. I'll jump in with an announcement of mine that you all know already. The Excel Summit is on Thursday, so we're only 2 days away. I'm still trying to let folks know to register and share registration. Register if you haven't already. Feel free to register even if you can't attend. That way we'll have your information shared in the Excel's matrix, and also that'll make sure that you get to it will make sure that you get all the updates and recordings and follow-up information that will come this winter. And again, if you're not able to come on Thursday, we have working groups that will be meeting regularly throughout the next few months. So let me know if you're interested in participating in a working group, and there'll be plenty of opportunities to get involved throughout. I'm seeing lots of questions coming in the chat. So what time is registration deadline tomorrow to register? That is noon tomorrow. And that is set because we're going to take all the information that we have from registration and put it into the Excel's matrix that Frank is overseeing, which will be shared at the event and will be a living resource for people to check in with and see who's working in what sectors and potential connections that they could use and that type of thing. You can still register after noon tomorrow. You can register up until the event starts. But that's just the deadline for being included in the matrix. And then, yeah, so the link to join is actually going to be sent out tomorrow. I've been holding off on sharing the Zoom link for security purposes, just because we've had issues with weird Zoom things happening if we share the link too early. So I'm going to send that out tomorrow, and that will be in people's calendars tomorrow. So that's a very good question. And I'm excited. I think it'll be very good. We have many people on the call here who've been deeply involved, and I'm appreciative of that, and it'll be good. Any other questions about Excels or other announcements? Okay, well, feel free to keep putting things in the chat. And I was thinking we could talk about the new national climate assessment that was released this morning. I'm not an expert on it by any means, but I thought we could go through it. And actually, Frank is still with us, so I don't know if you have any inside scoops, Frank, that you want to share. Or
I do.
That's fantastic. I'll let you go ahead.
Sure. So I'm really happy to share with you all. I put some links in there. The 5th National Climate Assessment was released this morning, and it's does some really important new things. that there's been a lot of leadership innovation inside the 5th National Climate Assessment. I was part of the leadership team for the 4th National Climate Assessment, which was released in 2018 under the Trump administration. This one's coming out under the Biden administration, obviously, and the some of the new important findings, beyond the science. Sorry, I just ate some chili that I didn't mean to eat. Trying to scarf down some food in my feel like a teacher again. Eating is in 5 minutes. Is the the Art X competition that the Office of Science and Technology Policy and the U.S. Global Change Research Program ran, is woven through this assessment. That's new. That's never happened before. And that artwork is really important to think. It's not art as science communication. It's art about climate. The gallery, the work, there will be likely a physical gallery of this work in the National History Museum in Washington, D.C., adjacent to the Ocean Hall. But I mean, just the way they wove art about climate, not art, science communication, all over this is really important. There is a poem by the National Poet Laureate at the very beginning of the National Climate Assessment. That's new. They've never had poems in a National Climate Assessment. So I think what this really signifies to us is that climate is moving beyond a science education, science communication, science engagement issue into a much broader set of modalities. And the fact that the National Climate Assessment, which is congressionally required by the Global Change Act of 1990, is doing this, I think matches a lot of the stuff we're hearing in the climate literacy guide process, which is saying this is a multidisciplinary issue way beyond what we're doing in just historically, we were working mostly in the science domain as a focus on climate. That's new. And I think that this matches that shift. A couple other innovations that are really important, besides just, every region has updates that are really important second findings. Absolutely. But there's some new chapters. I don't remember which one there are, but you can easily compare the 4th assessment to the 5th assessment. But, really just spend some time getting in there. Also the White House announcement I shared with you announcing this release has a lot of other context and important information that I think might be important to consider. New announcements of initiatives that just, a lot of money is moving and a lot of new initiatives going in the space. So I would look at the announcement beyond just the assessment itself. And then the last one, just to help set up some context, and I'll take some questions for, help clarifying what I'm talking about, is the NCA Atlas, which I think is atlas@globalchange.gov, is a Esri developed atlas that's really extends the data into much more extensibility. Something in my office played a large role in making happen. So the NCA Atlas is a new innovation that I think is really important for the work we do to learners and educators work with this issue. That data is really important to the state-of-the-art climate information that serves the nation with the context of the assessment itself. So I think that's a good setup. So hopefully we can. If you have any questions, happy to answer them. There you go, Patrick. You got it.
I don't
And
have,
then,
but just a comment. I saw
Sure.
that there are webinars, and I know when the last climate assessment came out, I attended some of the webinars, and they were really, really useful. Like to hear directly from the scientists involved
Yep.
About the data and the information. So I don't know what the webinars will be like this time around again, but I assume they'll be just as good, if not better. So I highly recommend those.
Okay. Thank you, Ingrid. There will be. I don't know where that's announced. All the webinars, but I believe every chapter will have its own webinar. which includes regions, sectors, and cross-cutting issues like mitigation, adaptation, things of that nature. So I guess the one other point, thank you, Ingrid, for reminding me, is that late in the process of NCA 5, a lot of the education community really wanted more emphasis on education in the assessment. Just to remind you all that the part of the reason why that couldn't happen was because the first order draft and the outline process was years ago. And so really making big sizable changes late in the process was hard. However, I mean, this work goes on. And so the 6th National Climate Assessment is beginning. So one thing, if you care about this, to pay attention to the outline development in the 6th National Climate Assessment that will come out in 4 years. So I know it's a long process issue, but, you know, do pay attention to the outline for the 6th assessment as you are, you know, like what didn't happen, what should have happened. How you make that happen is really pushing on the outline to include new topics. You'll see there were new chapters added, so they do that. They could add a chapter on something that we think is important if there's enough literature, people, and in early engagement.
Yeah, there is a podcast there as well, which has five episodes, and I listened to the first while making lunch today, and I was pleased that they actually talked about education in the first podcast, and
Awesome.
also talked about some of the ways in which the process has evolved and why the NCA 5 looks different from the NCA 4 and stuff like that.
Thank you, John. That's awesome. I haven't watched this podcast. I know they were super excited at last year's AGU that they were starting to move that direction. So the fact that they got there, that's another innovation that is awesome. If you don't know Allison Crimmins, who's the director of the National Climate Assessment this round, super innovative, effective, amazing leader. So she's done some really, really, really strong innovations in this work. So, I mean, great deal of compliment to her and her leadership. Anything else?
Yeah, I can ask a question. Okay, Gina? Frank, I would take that the National Climate Assessment is yet another great example of how, you tell me if this is true or not, that we've seen a lot of progress of the different agencies of the federal government more really communicating and comparing notes and how are we going to do this, and you know they're not siloed, right? You know, in a much better way. And so this is sort of an informal request, right? Where there are certain things that have to be different, but through it there's sort of chatter or discussion about what different agencies get excited about. And one of the ones I'm definitely looking for is what agencies would take it as, this is wonderful, we love to get kind of prompted by this, where others would say, oh, can we, don't bother us, that's not our business, we don't do this. That when there are young people, middle and high school students reaching out to an agency,
podcasts are being released in conjunction.
Reaching out to an agency and saying, hey, we want to work with you to improve something the agency is doing, right?
Yeah.
Smithsonian has been outstanding. They have taken every piece of advice our students have given them to get rid of their incandescents. And it was clear our students made it happen. So for instance, you know, one is we are now getting very serious about contacting the White House and have to figure out, well, what parts of the White House should we go to? Don't start with Biden. He's busy. He's got some big things, but there's Jill Biden and there's the people who, the electricians, and there's all those things. But I guess the more general is, are there agencies that we should be paying attention to that would love that the students come and saying, hey, we can work to improve something here together. And they would like the idea that they get to work with the students. Does that make sense? That, you know, some students, some like to work with students and saying, hey, that's not our job. That's Frank's job. He does education. Go away. You know.
So I mean, I think one thing is very true, Jim, is that youth engagement, youth leadership, youth initiatives is been ascending in the federal government since 2012. And there's like, for example, there is a political appointee in NOAA leadership. Her name is Lauren Gibson, and she's the youth advisor to the administrator, is a shorthand way of describing her title. She's amazing. And, you know, there are other youth leaders and youth initiatives that are going on. So there's definitely greater engagement. And I think that, you know, if you need help with how to engage the White House, I'm more than happy to help advise where those entry points are and those points of contact, because, you know, the White House website is pretty opaque. So I'm happy to support that, Jim. But I think, you know, each agency, if you look at the announcement that is associated with the FISH National Climate Assessment, you can really see the named new initiatives, what each agency is doing. And I think, you know, if you haven't already caught on, this is an all of government initiative. One of his first executive orders said it is the policy of the US government that climate is an all of government priority. That includes veteran affairs, IMLS, transportation, labor, you know, HUD, not the normal characters like NOAA, NASA, and so on. So just figuring out our labyrinth of process is tricky. I'm more than happy to help advise on how to do that. But one other thing I would say is, and it's showing up in the summit I'm in right now, is what education students want. Often climate is a really high priority on, you know, doing justice to this issue for their learning and their peers. The agency that would hear that the most would be NOAA. And so if that message does come in, because we're talking about the National Climate Assessment, I'm happy to facilitate that exchange of listening to young people about really what they want. There are initiatives where we've asked students, what education do you want? There's an initiative out of ASU called, God, I blanked on the card name, Avetta did it, but basically asking students, what education do you want? And often we don't ask them. And so, you know, having an ability to drop that message, whatever it is, would be important in this work. So Jim, I'm happy to continue to facilitate that exchange and help you navigate our very, very complicated process. But its complexity isn't the barrier. Like it's not a no, it's just a how to is the challenge.
And if people don't mind, thank you, Frank. That will be enormously helpful. The students learn, and they want to. They've got. We know exactly where the White House has incandescent lights. It's loaded with them on the north side. We know exactly where they are, and they just want to gently help. And when it's one thing when people might hear this, but when you see the images of that's an incandescent, they leave them on all night. And the Biden folks will look at it and say, well, we got to change that. We're the role model. The students would help.
Okay. So Jim, for that exact conversation, there is a chief sustainability officer for the US government.
Mm-hmm.
They're in the Office of Council of Environmental Quality.
Mm-hmm.
You can go to, I think it's sustainability.gov,
Mm-hmm.
and you can find who that is. I believe Lori is Lori, and I can't remember her. She has got a 2-part last name,
Mm-hmm.
but I think that's if you want to have that exchange, I can help you find the right person to have that exchange with.
Yeah, thank you. And clearly, it's a win-win, right? This is not
Of course,
not throwing mud, right? So
no, absolutely.
right. Thank you, Frank, so much.
Sure, happy to do it. I see we're at 1:28. If there are any other questions, I'm going to drop off so I can get back into session, but happy to keep going if that's needed.
I had a couple questions, but
sure, no, go for it, Patrick.
Quick. Okay.
Well, I mean, I can sit back down. Sorry, let me get the sun just right. I look like I have a nimbus.
The angle of the sun's really important to the flow of these questions. I really
well,
appreciate
if
that.
you want to see my face, it is.
Oh, absolutely. So given that I just have scanned things so far and haven't taken a deep dive in,
Sure.
a lot of push in a lot of areas is orienting to social justice and solutions and less to science. And I see some of that going on here, but I also see a heavy bent still into the science and awareness pieces of it. I'm wondering how that balance was struck, and kind of on a similar note, as I scanned through it, in the intro and the chapters on mitigation and adaptation, I didn't find the word education once. So I was curious about that.
So I mean, so a couple things. I mean, boy, you are. So let me give you just a little bit of context to your question. Right now, we are rewriting the climate literacy guide. We are using the 5th National Climate Assessment as our scientific source and language on the science knowledge part, you know, but not just science, but the knowledge part heavily right now, negotiating back and forth with the heads of these science agencies under the Subcommittee on Global Change Research. So there's a lot of really advanced language across the National Climate Assessment. We have found a lot of it related to justice, action, fairness, disproportionate impact. There's a lot of really good language buried in there. You are going to be not happy when you start seeing the connection between education and what we can do to address the climate crisis. In fact, the climate crisis as a frame is something we're struggling with. That said, part of why that is because this is a scientific assessment, and the scientific authorities and the scientific enterprise really struggle at action, justice, and building social capacity to address. I mean, that's just not their. I've been in the federal enterprise for 28 years. This is really hard for them. And so what who is really good at what we're talking about doesn't really exist yet. We're becoming it. We have not become it. So I think, you're going to see a progression from NCA 1 to NCA 2 to NCA 3 to NCA 4 to NCA 5. That is, there's movement, but we have not arrived at what you and I know needs to be. So I think, I would encourage you and all to see the progress that has been there, and yet what more has yet to be at the same time. So, I mean, that's just the best way I can say it, Patrick. Do see the progress. It's a lot. It's just not as far as we're ahead of them. And I don't mean that in a patronizing or belittling way. We just are.
Cool. Thanks, Frank. Appreciate you addressing that.
Sure. Is that good enough?
Yeah, I really wish education was in there a little bit more, some of those other things, but I will look at it as a progression rather than a standalone.
And maybe one other thing is they're going to call for things, but the only way you can do it is through education, but they just don't know how to say, like, if we need to increase, society's capacity to adapt. Well, how the hell do you think that's going to happen without education? So they name things that the modality of doing it is missing, but what they're calling for clearly would be education heavy. So I think finding those and then getting into the action steps of how to achieve that is where you're going to find education. It's like reading between the lines exercise. It's going to be very much like that in this context. But naming those as like, well, I see you named this is important. Now let's give you how to do that, which has a strong education in all its modalities of education. That's how we're going to see our map. And we've done this analysis already, and we see hooks, but they're not like boldly us yet. We have to name that with them.
Yep. Got to keep pushing it out there. It's getting
well, one thing you may not know is on Clean, we have the teaching the National Climate Assessment pages, and there's framing text that is involved in that page. That has not really changed for a long time. So as we update those pages, and NOAA's already invested in series to do that work in partnership with us. So that's begun in planning. Now we have the thing to actually do the work the National Climate Assessment. How we frame those pages and how we frame the update of the climate literacy guide in Clean and the portal, I think is how we'll begin to socialize what we contribute to the doing of what the assessment calls for and acknowledges. That's probably a good way to leave, because I've got some lunch I got to eat, and unless you got a compelling question, I'm gonna go back to my Beyond 100K.
Thank you,
We
Frank.
good?
Thanks, Frank.
All right, Jazz. Thank you all. Dig in. There's a lot there. I think you're going to be impressed and inspired to push it further.
Thank you, Frank. Have a good rest of your conference.
Thank you all.
Patrick, you're always asking the right questions. so good at analyzing things. I'm glad you're on the call today.
Thanks.
I was thinking that we could, we still have over 20 minutes. I was thinking I could share my screen quickly and we could just look at it together. Because I know folks are so busy, maybe, I might not even have time to actually look at it and go through it. But yes, please feel free, anyone to, I'm by far not an expert on this at all, so feel free anyone to like unmute and jump in and that type of thing. So I was just looking at the chapters. And I don't know how different this is from previous NCAs, but it feels like it's laid out in a pretty understandable way. I don't know how they determine the topics, but yes, they really have everything but education. I know that they have had chapters on air quality and human health in the past, but I'm always excited to see those because I feel like that's probably, with my climate communication background, I feel like those are always some of the most compelling factors with climate change. I just feel like a focus on human health is really not something that you can argue with being controversial. Health is important. I don't know if does anyone know if the Indigenous Peoples section is new? I think that's a pretty important section. Oops.
For some reason, I'm having trouble seeing even the same thing that you are. How did you get to chapters? Like I am seeing.
Can you see my screen, like the homepage for the NCA on my shared screen?
Yeah.
Yes. Yeah.
Okay.
There's a chapters drop down up here on the left.
Okay.
And I had to click on it. It doesn't seem like covering works. At least for my computer.
I'm not surprised that education isn't in there a lot, because I think in general, this, like previous assessments, is it's not so much about solutions. I mean, there are 2 chapters about solutions, but really I think it's, as the name suggests, it's an assessment of like what has happened to our climate and how is it affecting us, but it's not like a climate action plan saying this is what we need to do about it. So of course it'd be good if there were more about education there in the small parts they have about solutions, but I wouldn't expect to see that much here. And I think it's different from the IPCC reports in that way too. Like the IPCC reports have their assessment parts, but then they also have large sections about solutions, but this doesn't. And I don't think that's its intention.
That's an interesting comparison I hadn't thought of. Yeah, they might just be thinking it's out of scope for the NCA.
Mm-hmm. Then one could ask, well, where should that be? Like, where is the U.S. government's climate action plan? And right. I don't know.
Well, and they have this responses section, so you would think it could at least fall under
Right.
mitigation. Well, either of these, honestly. I was gonna say mitigation, but adaptation too.
Yeah.
And this is a very small section compared to all the topics, you know.
Hmm.
I have no doubt that this is very hard to pull together, but that does seem a little bit lacking there. I'd be interested to see what they have to say about the COVID-19 pandemic, because the fourth assessment was prior to COVID-19, right? Am I wrong about that?
Yeah.
And not to sound like a broken record, but it does have this connection, like I was just saying, to human health. And I don't think probably many people realize how climate change can increase diseases. So I don't know. It's not at all education related, but yeah. Does anyone know about this art and climate section? In the email that they sent out this morning, that was a big piece of what they a big section of the newsletter that they had released was art, which also seems to be some kind of climate communication method. I don't know if they've had this in the past, but it's interesting, certainly. Yeah. Are there any other thoughts or things that we've noticed about the report that would be good to look at?
It's nice that they have a section that says all figures, because that's how I've often used figures from previous reports. So nice to have them all in one place.
Maybe this is a silly question, but how is so the Atlas link is the same information, but presented in a different way? I'm confused.
The Atlas link that was shared in here earlier. Sorry, I missed a lot of things in the chat.
Yeah, it turns out that's where I first went, which was why I wasn't seeing the same thing. But I was like, I thought it was the same thing because it's about NCA 5 and so I was like, okay, this is a different link though, atlas.globalchange.gov.
Huh.
Which is details and methods for processing the projection data found in the NCA. Yeah, I just am like, what is the relationship between these two different?
This seems like it's a tool that they developed to help people understand the NCA. That would be my guess.
Yeah, it seems like sort of a sister site where you can find visualizations.
That's super interesting, Wendy. I actually didn't know that this would.
Yeah, it was just right below, it looks like Frank put first the NCA site and then the Atlas site. So I had clicked on that and thought that I was in, the climate assessment because it's the same stuff. But then I'm going, I am on a different site, and then realizing that they somehow go together.
That's super interesting. Yeah, I know. I feels like it's an interactive tool that they made to just look at the data differently. It is kind of, Colleen said it's kind of weird, but it's a whole other site. Yeah, because I don't think that it doesn't look like they linked to it anywhere. You would think it would be pretty obvious where they link to it on the main site, but I'm not seeing that anywhere actually. So, huh. It's definitely, I mean, definitely has the NCA 5 logo on it, so yeah, definitely a sister site.
Good thing Frank put the link to the atlas in the chat, otherwise we wouldn't have known about it.
Yeah, exactly. I wonder if see that. Did he put the main link too? Yeah, so interesting. Cool. Any other thoughts or things that feel like they're missing, or cool aspects of this that you found?
I'm pretty curious about their two new chapters in the national topics section, the economics chapter and the social systems and justice chapters. I think that spending some time with those should be fun, because that's where I think a lot of energy is helpfully directed. So looking forward to jumping in there. The economics, I think, helps take some of the partisanship out of it if you can really look at the money and make that argument. And the social justice chapter, I mean, I wish it was spread throughout, but I'm glad it's there.
Yeah, that's fair. It's more of an overarching, I don't even want to call it a topic, but overarching lens, maybe is a better word, rather than something that should just have its be pigeonholed into a chapter. But what's this traceability? Yeah.
Another comment. So for the third national climate assessment, I think that came out in 2014. There were a bunch of us in the Clean Network who put together an educator's guide to the national climate assessment. And like I worked on the Northeast section with Tamara Ledley and Jane Hines Fry, and other people worked on I guess we split it up by region. It was a lot of work, so I'm not suggesting we do that again. But I wonder, I don't know if Noah or someone else is planning to put together educators guides, or if it's just not part of it this time around.
We are. It happened for the fourth as well. We worked with graduate students for the fourth and did an excellent job. And this time we've got a pretty cool team at CU and Clean. Got a couple interns lined up. And an interesting aspect of this time, we're going to partner with Association for Science and Technology Centers on part of it, because found out that they were also creating materials for their organizations so they could share about it. And I think partnering with them will be really interesting to see what we can pull out that spans the formal and the informal. I think there'll be a lot, but it'll also be interesting to see the differences of what informal institutions really want to highlight out of the assessment as opposed to what teachers might find valuable. So that'll be a fun process. We'll be doing that this spring, and it should be done in June.
That's great.
Yeah, that is, I knew a little bit about that, but Patrick just summarized it way better. Because we do have this section on the Clean website, but right now it's now it's going to be outdated. And I know we're feeling the same thing with the climate literacy guide that Frank has been redoing and will be released soon. Everything is happening at once, it seems. Jim, you have your hand up.
Yes, thanks, Gina. So I've certainly been enjoying and learning from people's observations, discoveries, comments here. I think I'd throw in a little bit of maybe there's the generational differences of how education has been, say, in civics, maybe what people of my generation, my age would have learned, what people learn now. There's quite a difference of that. At least the ideal of a democratic society, what we have, we don't want it turned into, forgetting what that ideal is, that the ideal is not the federal government makes all the decisions, does the research, and tells everybody else what to do, and that's the way it works. So when they don't put in something that we think is right, we kind of go, why aren't they doing that? Because in an ideal, at least the ideal civics thing, at least that I learned, is that the government is responsive also to what people are saying to the government or demanding to the government or even pressuring the government to do. So I mean, a lot of times when I see the things that the federal government isn't doing as much as maybe it should, or I recognize and say, well, after all, we have a country that is dominated by two parties, the Republicans and the Democrats, and just about everything the federal government does is a compromise between those two parties. It doesn't do much that doesn't pass the veto power of one party's representative or another. But what I'm getting at is that a lot of times it is up to us to create the conditions where the federal government may take a while, but it is responsive. And I kind of feel that the federal government is often responsive to this, both parties. You may not want to do climate education, maybe if you're a Republican. You may not want to talk about social justice and so on. But at a certain point, if you never do, you become irrelevant to the people. Because if you can't address good education, if you can't address what young people are on their minds and what matters to them, then you're irrelevant. And I don't think the Republicans and I don't think the Democrats want to be irrelevant. You have a chance to influence education. So, I think that's a little bit of sometimes when if they are presented with great things that are happening amongst students in schools and things, sooner or later they're going to get it. We better get on that bandwagon or we're just going to be like, no one's paying attention to us anymore. Anyway, just a thought of a kind of, the way we can influence it a lot of times is with our leading examples that I think the federal government is paying attention as slow as they may act sometimes. Thank you.
I think that's an important point. And I was also thinking about almost the inverse. We talk about similar things in Michigan, like, why doesn't the Department of Ed do X? And they're often telling us, like, that's not our role. And I actually think that that's true in a lot of ways. Like, the government shouldn't be telling us as citizens what to do, but it should be in the business of giving us good information. So in that sense, the report reflects, right, like the costs a lot of money and takes a lot of time and effort to get good information. And that's what's in the report. And then what we do about it, that's up to citizens, right? That's who we vote for. And that is the institutions we build. And that's the role of an informed citizen, is to like use the information to determine what do we do. And then this goes back to the whole science itself. You can't get an ought from an is, right? If the report is a scientific report, this is what is happening. And then what we ought to do about it is a separate question based on our values and based on whether we care that this stuff is happening or not.
I've never heard that phrase before, Wendy. That's a good way of putting it. Ought versus an is.
I appreciate that focus, but I might push back a little bit. Just in the realm of like, science has so long been in this, it's put itself in this role of like, we will give you objective information and pretend it's not value laden. We will push these facts out here and say, yeah, we just do the facts. That's our role. We don't have a stake in it. We don't have, a political view in it. And I think we've gotten to a point where can largely recognize that science is value laden and inherently political. And by ignoring that in a report like this and not connecting it to say, here are the possible solutions, not giving some nod to like, here's a bunch of information and we're not going to tell you what's right and wrong, but we can at least outline what collective action could look like to address these issues and dig into that a little bit more in order to prime that possibility of moving forward. I don't know. I don't know if that's their responsibility or not, but I feel like it's been ducked for a long time in that realm of like, here's the information, that's what we do, without taking responsibility for the impact.
I think that's a good point too, that there's, two sides of the coin. And I agree with what you're saying about science itself is value laden. But I do think that it also comes to this like authority kind of piece of like, what is the role of government? And are they primarily in the business of, trying to uncover these facts and present them to citizens? Or are they, primarily in the business of sort of like guiding citizens of what to do?
Maybe one thing. So Wendy, I definitely agree with the ought and is recognizing the dichotomy and so on. I would also think though, if we look at the federal government and you look at just the names of the agencies and what they're doing, the vast majority of them have verbs. They are about action. They are, the Environmental Protection Agency, the Defense Department. It's not just we're studying the threat. We just and somebody else is going to go fight the wars, right? Or the line of defensive things. There's certain things that are sort of pressure points to get the federal government to say, come on, look what you're doing. Historically, what has the U.S. federal government done about indigenous knowledge? One is it committed genocide on a massive scale, and especially how it taught what it did. It put people in concentration camps, and then it basically stripped the culture of the indigenous children. You are going to learn English. You're going to learn in a very strict way that education comes from the top down. You will sit with your hands closed, and you will learn from us, and you will do it. And if you do anything, you will get beaten. And that is very different than the traditional indigenous ways, where it's multicultural. Young people play a much more active role. That's something I come up against all the time, of trying to encourage the situation where young people are recognized as important and play a role, not just sit back and wait until you have a PhD. But I think we have to recognize historically the federal government has been absolutely awful on this. So that doesn't mean to criticize the people who are now, that doesn't mean that everybody's responsible for that guilt or something, but it's to recognize that we have to undo that damage, and the federal government has an obligation to undo the damage it did around continually teaching propaganda that was designed to suppress and crush indigenous knowledge. That's a big part of how we educate in the United States, is to not allow people to learn the way indigenous people learned. So that's just a thought on action. The federal government has always been a very active part of society, and does research. Now, the parts who do research, it's a little different, right? The people who are doing research need to have a little bit different place.
Yeah, I just want to add in that first of all, I think this is a very interesting conversation, and there's a lot to be said from both sides. Jim, you're not wrong about like the majority of the departments have an action verb in their name. For example, this report is out of the US Global Change Research Program, right? And so their whole point is research. There isn't any other action that I think this particular branch of the government can take. And even NOAA, this was a very interesting conversation that I had with an administrator out of NOAA at the recent National Association of Biology Teachers conference, was that one of the reasons NOAA was able to fly under the radar for so long is because they don't make any suggestions about what to do with the data. They just report on the data. And it wasn't until, as she put it to me, the Sharpie gate with the Sharpie and the hurricane pathways, that NOAA did come under fire. So I think there is something to be said for those organizations that can quietly do the work that is necessary without drawing any political fire, and still fight the good fight I do think that there does need to be some action from other departments, particularly the education department. But the unfortunate aspect of that is that our system is so fractured with so much of education being put into states' rights that there is not a whole lot that can be done there on the federal level. So I guess the question becomes, how do we disseminate and how do we take action on the state level to make sure that these different aspects of the assessment that are so lagging behind are actually addressed? And what is our responsibility to that?
It's a great discussion. Yeah, and we're pretty much at time right now. Thank you everyone for your thoughts and for having this for having this discussion. And I guess we'll see as time goes on what the outcomes of this report will be, and if it'll be any different from the past four. We'll see, especially with those new chapters. But I'm glad we get the chance to talk about it, and thank you everyone for bringing your thoughts to the table. I'll see some of you on Thursday.
Thanks,
Thanks.
everyone.
Like,
Bye.
Bye.
but I end up as meeting host. Bye, Jim.